Welcome friends to the Secret Doctrine webinar. We are going to explore today the second part of the first stanza. The first stanza is the one that talks about the rest or the night of the universe, when the universe is at rest, is in a state of dissolution. In our previous class we have explored the first part, and now we'll continue with the second part of the stanza. So the shloka we are going to examine today is, or begin with, is the shloka 6. It reads, "The seven sublime lords and the seven truths had ceased to be, and the universe, the sun of necessity, was immersed in paranishpana, to be outbreathed by that which is and yet is not was." So the first characters that this shloka mention are the seven sublime lords. These are celestial beings, which are the first beings to appear in the universe when manifestation begins. Of course, we are not at that stage right now. This is why the shloka says that the seven sublime lords were not. So let's see what Blavatsky says about them. She says, "The seven sublime lords are the seven creative spirits, the Dhyan Chohans, who correspond to the Hebrew Elohim. It is the same hierarchy of archangels in the Christian theogony." So these seven creative spirits can be interpreted in two different ways. It may be the seven highest beings at the threshold of manifestation, or it may be a reflection of them, the architects of our world, the Elohim, as Blavatsky is talking there. The Elohim are the seven spirits that build our world. So from the physical plane's perspective, these Elohim are the highest beings. But then if we go deeper into the spiritual planes, there are higher hierarchies that represent these seven dhyanis, these seven celestial beings. In different traditions, they have different names for the creative spirits. Now, the idea in theosophy is that these seven beings are a differentiation and manifestation of the one being. So in that diagram, we have the one being would be represented by the white circle. This, if we go to the highest plane, this white circle would correspond to the one monad, the one being, in which all the other monads or divine sparks are synthesized. This is the ultimate reality, not necessarily as the absolute, but the ultimate reality of being, in the sense of this one being that is at the basis of everything in the universe. Now, when we have seen that the one has, in itself, has a potentiality for the positive and the negative, for all what we perceive as opposites. So why the one goes into seven? The progression is the following. From this one being, when the one being differentiates into its positive aspects and its negative aspects, and we are using positive and negative in a philosophical sense, not for good and bad, when there is this polarization and then those polarities separate, then we have a duality. We have, subject and object, positive, negative, masculine, feminine. Now, as soon as we have this duality, as we talked in the first class, there is a third element that appears, which is the relationship between these two poles. So it may be, for example, in an atom, when you separate the electrons, the negative charges, from the protons in the nucleus, that are the positive charges, then electricity manifests as a third element. Or when you have a subject of perception and the object of perception, the perception itself that brings the two of them in touch would be the third element. So from 1 we go to 2, from 2 we go through 3. And then when we have 3 basic elements, as we have seen, the triad is the basic principle that from which the universe manifests. When we have 3 basic elements, there are 7 possible combinations of these elements. So mathematically, if you have 3 elements, you can combine them in 7 different ways. And this is why, from a mathematical point of view, from the trinity, from the triad, we come into 7 basic manifestations. Some example that is familiar to all of us is the idea of the 3 primary colors, and then the 7, basic colors that we normally talk about. But this happens in many other aspects of life and the universe. So these 7 beings are the first differentiation of the one being on whatever plane we are positioning ourselves. Now she also says that the 7 truths had ceased to be. And she explains, out of the 7 truths and revelations, or rather revealed secrets, 4 only have been handed to us, as we are still in the 4th round, and the world also has only had 4 Buddhas so far. But as every new root race, the concept in theosophy of a root race is an evolutionary period of humanity, we have accomplished 4 evolutionary periods and we are experiencing the 5th one. So Blavatsky says, as every new root race at the head of a round of different rounds of evolution must have its revelation and revealers, the next round of evolution will bring the 5th truth, the following the 6th, and so on. This is a very complicated question and will receive more ample treatment later on. So she doesn't really explain what these 7 truths are, but what she says is that with every round of evolution, there is one more truth that is revealed to humanity, and that humanity is supposed to strive to realize. So this may remind us, because of the mention of the Buddhas, for example, of the 4 noble truths in Buddhism. The 4th truth is the truth of the spiritual path, of the effort to realize the truth behind things. Now, perhaps in the next round of evolution, which in the theosophical view is in several millions of years in the future, perhaps at that time there will be some other evolutionary goal that humanity as a whole needs to pursue, and then the religious teachers that will incarnate will be promoting that particular evolutionary goal, which at the present may be not appropriate for us, may be premature. So the idea in the first part of the shloka is that these truths themselves were not, because as we are going to see, the whole universe was in a state of absolute perfection. The truths as a revelation to humanity appear when there is ignorance, when we need to strive to perceive truth. But that was not the case when the universe is in a state of unity. So both the 7 sublime beings, this differentiation of beings, and the 7 truths were not at this time. And she goes on, and the universe, the son of necessity, was immersed in paranishpana, which she adds that it's absolute perfection, paranirvana, which is Yom-group. So first see that the whole universe is called the son of necessity. And the idea with this is that sometimes people ask, why, if the absolute is perfect in itself, if during pralaya there is perfection, why do we have a manifestation? Why does the unity engage in multiplicity. And the shloka says that this is a necessity. We can interpret this from different points of view. We may say that the periods of manifestation and pralaya are just the natural result of the very nature of the Absolute. We many times ask why, but the why is a question that comes or that makes sense only on the mental level. On higher spiritual levels, that question of why is not really necessary or important from certain points of view. For example, when we ask why when we don't see the reason for something. But when we do something because it is our very nature, because this is the right thing to do, when we do it not because we want to get anything from it, but because this is how things are, then we don't ask ourselves why. We just do whatever is our nature. So the son of necessity, the idea of necessity, the necessity of the manifested universe, may be interpreted that it is by the very nature of the Absolute, it necessarily follows, if we understand the nature of the Absolute, that the Absolute will show itself in these two ways, as the absolute unity and as this multiplicity. Also, the idea of necessity may be interpreted from a different point of view, and that is that in order to generate a certain awareness that seems to remain always in the process of evolution, even when the universe is dissolved, in order to produce that awareness, then the oneness has to go through the process of multiplicity. So we are going to see a little of that too. But what this part of the shloka says is that the universe, which is the son of necessity, was immersed in paranishpana. This term, the right spelling and pronunciation is parinishpana, as you see there on the screen, but Blavatsky used paranishpana. So she says that this parinishpana is the absolute perfection to which all existences attain at the close of a great period of activity, or Mahamanvantara in Sanskrit, and in which they rest during the succeeding period of repose, or pralaya. So she says that this parinishpana is a absolute perfection to which all existences attain. Every monad in the universe, manifesting through elemental kingdoms or through mineral, plants, animals, human beings, celestial beings, all monads attain a state of perfection during pralaya. Now she says, it is absolute perfection only in a relative sense, for it must give room to still further absolute perfection according to a higher standard of excellence in the following period of activity. So it is absolute in the sense that it's the highest state that would be possible of attaining in this particular period of manifestation. But in the theosophical view, every new universe, every new manifestation brings up the possibility of higher or deeper or further states of perfection. So there is never a ceiling to the development of the monads. Of course, we cannot conceive what this means, and we can only grasp the idea that the purpose of a cycle of evolution is to produce a certain perfection. This perfection is accomplished at the end of the period of evolution, but the next universe will bring new opportunities. Now she says everything has to be viewed as ideal. How we interpret that word ideal, I think she's talking about everything has to be viewed as mentally constructed, as an idea, with the exception of paranirvana. This parinirvana is a synonym of parinishpana. So everything has to be viewed as a mental construct, with the exception of parinirvana, by him who would comprehend that state the state of parinirvana, and acquire a knowledge of how non-ego, voidness, and darkness are three in one and alone self-existent and perfect. You see, when in Buddhism they discuss the shunyata, this emptiness, or they describe nirvana, they describe it in similar ways to what the Secret Doctrine is talking about here. Non-ego, they call it non-self, anatman or anatta. Voidness, that would be shunyata, emptiness. And darkness, they don't necessarily use this word, but is connected with this idea. Now, that is many times interpreted as being simply a dissolution, the annihilation of anything that was there. Now, Blavatsky says this state that has these three aspects, non-ego, voidness, and darkness, is self-existent and perfect. You see, this is where it is very interesting, and the shlokas show their deep mystical nature, because normally we regard existence as what is good, and then non-existence we regard it as death. We regard light as good, and we regard darkness as bad, or simply the absence of light. Now, all mystics from different traditions, when they come to these mystical states, in one way or the other, they describe this particular, let's say, state of non-consciousness. As I mentioned, Blavatsky calls it conscious non-consciousness, because it is a state that is beyond our what we understand as consciousness. Consciousness is always relative. Consciousness belongs to the separate pieces in the universe. I am conscious of something that is different from me, that is separate from me. Consciousness is conditioned, is limited. But there is something beyond consciousness. That, in the stanzas, Blavatsky said, we have a word in the occult language for this, but in modern languages don't have that word. So Blavatsky translated this as the non-conscious consciousness, so that we don't think that is simply annihilation. Maybe we could call it a trance consciousness. It is a state that is not consciousness as we know it, but it doesn't mean that it's the opposite to consciousness, that is just being unconscious. It's something that transcends consciousness. So there is a state in which we transcend the sense of I-ness, of separate I-ness, in which there is voidness or emptiness, in the sense that being everything, there is nothing outside of ourselves. And there is this state of darkness, as Blavatsky explained, because it is a state that is beyond what we can see from here. In another quote that we read, Blavatsky says, remember that we name things according to how we see them from here. So from below, from the lower nature, this state of perfection appears as non-ego, appears as voidness, and appears as darkness. But every mystic that experienced this, or even each one of us, because we all can experience reflections of this state, this state is our true nature, so it is available to us. Of course, we need to make an effort in the sense of arrange our life in a way that will lead us little by little to be sensitive to this state in ourselves, and we need to engage in spiritual practice and in spiritual living. If we do this, these states are available to us. They are not something that can be experienced only by a Buddha, every once a few thousand years. Of course, there are different levels, different depths of this state of non-ego, voidness, and darkness, and the higher states may be beyond our reach right now, but we can always reach the reflection that is close to us. So the point here, this is a very a very important point to ponder over, to meditate, and as I keep repeating, when in meditation, if the true reality, the true essence of what we are is described as voidness, non-ego, and darkness, that is a guidance in our path. That means that in the process of self-knowledge, in the process of introspection, we have to go in this direction. Go towards what looks like void. Go towards what looks like you are leaving your ego behind. Go to what looks like darkness and dwell there, because this is the reflection of your true nature. So let us go back to the shloka. We read the sun, the universe, the sun of necessity, was immersed in paranishpana, in this perfect state which we perceive as non-ego, voidness, and darkness. And then the shloka continues, to be outbreathed by that which is and yet is not was. So she explains the appearance and disappearance of the universe are pictured as an outbreathing and inbreathing of the great breath, which is eternal and which, being motion, is one of the three aspects of the absolute. The absolute abstract space and the duration being the other two. So we have explored this in the first class. The great breath is the aspect of absolute abstract motion. And then we have these two other aspects of the absolute. So the universe, the image that the stanzas use is the out-breathing of the universe. This absolute abstract motion at some point changes in such a way that generates differentiation in the unity. There was a certain motion, absolute motion, so it's difficult to grasp this. Don't think that this is the motion of something moving. There is an absolute principle of motion which, as long as it remains absolute, everything is in unity. But when a change happens, when somehow this motion becomes relative, let's say, then the manifestation of the universe begins. Of course, all these things are beyond what our mind can grasp. However, trying to grasp these things, even if we fail, because we will, the effort of grasping these things begin to awaken our higher mind, as we have discussed in the past. There is this esoteric axiom that the organ follows the function, meaning if we are going to have the ability to perceive the formless, first we have to start trying to use that ability. At the beginning we can't, because we don't have like a spiritual organ that allows the perception of the formless. But how do we develop this spiritual organ? By trying to perceive that which we cannot perceive. That effort will develop the ability, little by little, gradually, to grasp all this, not just as a concept, but more intuitively. So then Blavatsky says, by that which is and yet is not, is meant the great breath itself. You see the paradoxes here. The great breath is not, and yet it is. Because the form of existence, the nature of the great breath, is above, is beyond these dualities that we know between existing and non-existing. So you will see that many times in many traditions, when talking about the ultimate reality, they will use paradoxes, because it seems paradoxical to us, because we only know the field of opposites. Since they are talking about something that is above the field of opposites, they say it's not this and it's not this, it's something beyond, or it's both at the same time. So she says, the great breath itself, which we can only speak of as absolute existence, but cannot picture to our imagination as any form of existence that we can distinguish from non-existence. So this is what we have been talking about. Now, the idea then was that there was no differentiation of beings. The sublime lords, which are the source of all other beings, were not. The revelations of truth were not. The whole universe, the son of necessity, was in a state of perfection, which is non-being, and yet it exists. That's more or less a summary of what that shloka says. Now the next one says the causes of existence had been done away with. The visible that was and the invisible that is rested in eternal non-being, the one being. So you see here again the paradox, the eternal non-being, which is the one being. Now the causes of existence were not any longer there. Therefore the universe did not exist. Now Blavatsky will talk a little about this cause of existence. She says, the causes of existence mean not only the physical causes known to science. For something to exist on Earth, for example, that structure needs, DNA, it needs certain proteins and a series of things so that this can come into existence. Or for a human being to exist, there has to be fecundation and all the process. So Blavatsky says we are not talking about the causes of physical existence, which are a reflection of the spiritual causes of existence. She says not the physical, but the metaphysical causes, the chief of which is the desire to exist, the outcome of Nidana and Maya. Remember we discussed Nidana is this concatenation of causes and effects, one cause producing an effect, and in turn that effect becoming a cause for another effect. In Buddhism, 12 of these causes and effects are described, and they are called the 12 Nidanas. And it's a description of how from shunyata we come to have a universe and a human being that is born and dies and is aware of suffering. Maya, also we discussed, that is the illusion, the inability to perceive things as they really are. Now, she says that the main cause of existence, which is an outcome of the Nidanas and Maya, is the desire to exist. In several traditions, when somebody asks why the manifestation manifests, or the universe manifests, or manifestation appears, sometimes it is said that it's because the divine nature desired to manifest, desired to create. And this is metaphorically speaking. The absolute can have no desire. The absolute is this absolute perfection which has no relative attributes. To have a desire, you need an entity, whether it is a celestial entity or it is a physical entity. So philosophically speaking, metaphysically speaking, we cannot say the absolute desire to manifest. We are giving attributes to the absolute that cannot be there. But when it is said that this divine nature desire to manifest, is because it seems that within the manifested universe, things appear because of this desire to exist. Everything in nature has in some way or the other a desire to exist. It has an instinct to go on, to preserve its own nature, to extend its existence. So we know this desire to exist as it manifests in human beings. We don't quite know how this manifests in animals or in vegetables or in devas or even in the mineral kingdom. But she says that this is the chief cause, the desire to exist, which at this point had ceased. And she explains a little about this nature. She says this desire for essential life shows itself in everything, from an atom to a sun, and is a reflection of the divine thought propelled into objective existence, into a law that the universe should exist. So you see, this desire to exist begins with the divine thought. The divine thought is already within the cosmic ideation. It's not part of the absolute nature. I mean, it's not part in the sense that it's already a differentiation of the absolute nature. And so we could say that this desire to exist is there in the highest manifested being. And then it pervades the whole of manifestation. According to the esoteric teaching, Blavatsky says, the real cause of that supposed desire and of all existence, the cause of the desire to exist, that is beyond beyond the divine thought, that cause remains forever hidden, and its first emanations are the most complete abstractions mind can conceive. So we can conceive to some extent the desire to exist in us. You know, why, if you meditate, you may be attain a very nice state of meditation one day, suppose. Very harmonious, peaceful, complete in itself. Why do you ever come out of that state of meditation? Why do you come out of it and engage again with the world that will bring conflict or distress or also joy, but suffering too? Why do we come out of a state of perfection? If you look inside, at some point there is this desire to exist, desire for sentient life, as Blavatsky says there, the desire to perceive the perfection of the unity that may be attained in meditation, because the desire to exist is still within us. That takes us out of the unity into manifestation, into multiplicity. And we have this thirst to experience the world again as a separate entity. So this desire to exist is what propels the universe forward in the process of manifestation into something that naturally beings would not want to do. The state of unity is a state of perfection. Why do beings come out of it? It's because of this desire to exist. Once that desire to exist is transcended, then there is a coming back to the unity. But in the process, there has been a development of consciousness, which was the purpose of the manifestation of the universe. So the last part of that shloka said, the visible that was and the invisible that is rested in eternal non-being, the one being. So again, she talks about the idea of eternal non-being, which is the one being, will appear a paradox to anyone who does not remember that we limit our ideas of being to our present consciousness of existence, making it a specific instead of a generic term. So we think that a being is a being as we are, as human beings. Therefore, when we think of the angels, we think that angels may be beings as we are. We think they have freedom of will, of choice, that they think, that they may feel love or hate. We naturally project, if there is a being there, then it must be just like us. And because of that way of looking at things, it's also for many in humanity difficult to accept that animals have consciousness or that plants have consciousness, because they don't show a conscious being in the same way that we are. So Blavatsky says this is our problem. It is only the higher mind, the one that can realize that being is a state that may admit many different variations. It is not all beings are being just like we are. So this is a problem that we have when trying to describe that which is beyond what we are. Then Blavatsky says the one being is the noumenon, the cause, the source of all the other noumena, of all the other causes, which we know must underlie the phenomena, the appearances that we see. So we see appearances that have many causes, but those causes themselves have an ultimate cause, which is the source of everything. And this is important because she's going back to the idea of oneness. We can say, well, this happens because of this, and that happened because of that, and these two things may seem unrelated. But in the theosophical view, all causes, all effects come from an ultimate one cause, which is the one being. And then, so she says, this one being is the one cause behind every phenomena, and give to everything in the universe, to all phenomena, whatever shadow of reality they possess, but which we have not the senses or the intellect to cognize at present. So neither through our intellect or through the senses can we perceive the one being. The one being, the one cause, this oneness can only be perceived with our spiritual senses. The spiritual life is a way of living that will stimulate the awakening of our spiritual senses, and in addition to the intellectual and the physical senses. So she says this one being exists, this is the reality behind everything, but it can only be perceived with our spiritual senses, and this is our work. So then another shloka, alone the one form of existence, stretched, boundless, infinite, causeless, in dreamless sleep, and life pulsated unconscious in universal space, throughout that all presence which is sensed by the open eye of the Dhamma. So this is the whole shloka, let's go little by little. Alone the one form of existence. Again, here she is saying that when the universe was in a state of rest, there was only one cause of one form of existence. You see, as we finish the first stanza, we will see that the key concept in the first stanza is this oneness. Everything that the shlokas say lead back to this oneness from in one way or the other, from one perspective or the other. So there was only one form of existence. And she says the tendency of modern thought is to recur to the archaic idea of a homogeneous basis for apparently widely different things. Heterogeneity developed from homogeneity. Heterogeneous means multiplicity, diverse, and homogeneity means oneness. And this was true at her time in modern thought, and this is true today too. When we talk about scientists have this idea, this intuition, I would call it, that there should be one theory that is able to explain everything in the universe. Right now, for example, in science, we have a set of equations and a theory that can explain things on a cosmic level, relativity of Einstein, and we have a different set of theories and equations that can explain what is very minute, the subatomic particles, which is the quantum physics, and the two of them cannot relate with each other. So they are looking for this one theory that can explain everything. Also with forces, we had in the past 4 fundamental forces in nature, in science: gravity and electromagnetism and a couple of nuclear forces. And now little by little they are coming to a view that all these forces seem to come from one single force. Now the two nuclear forces are seen as a variation of the electromagnetic force. And there is a tendency always to try to go to the origin, which scientists think have to be one. Well, from the esoteric point of view, this is true. Everything on every level eventually could be traced back to a certain oneness. So Blavatsky says the secret doctrine carries this idea, this physical idea that oneness or everything should come from a oneness, carries this idea into the region of metaphysics and postulates a one form of existence as the basis and source of all things. And she says, but perhaps the phrase the one form of existence is not altogether correct. So you see, this is how she chose to translate a Sanskrit word. She says the Sanskrit word is Prabhava Pyaya. So she was, or the shlokas, or with her teachers, it seems that she used the Sanskrit word, but then when she has to translate these shlokas in the secret doctrine, she has to choose how to translate all these terms. So this is why we said in one of the previous classes that what we have is Blavatsky's rendering of the stanzas. So this word, Prabhava Pyaya, which is two words in one, means the place, or rather plane, whence emerges the origination and into which is the resolution of all things. So it's this ground of being, if we want to call it that way, from which everything comes, into which everything comes back, from which everything emanates, into which everything dissolves again. And dissolves is not the correct word, but again, this is the problem with modern languages. So this one form of existence is the source and the final destiny of everything in the universe. That one form of existence alone was when the universe was in pralaya. And she says that this one form of existence stretched boundless, infinite, causeless, in dreamless sleep. So we can understand boundless, of course, if the only thing that was is this one form of existence, there are no limits, otherwise there would be two things, the one form of existence and whatever is outside of it. It is infinite, it is causeless. The idea is that this is the causeless cause. This was always there. There was no time in which this appeared. If something appears, it has to be caused by something. But then that other cause, if it appeared, should be caused by something else. You know, we have an infinite regression. So the esoteric philosophy postulates there is one form of existence that always was, always is, always will be. And this is the causeless cause of everything in the universe. But also it says that it stayed in dreamless sleep during the pralaya of the universe. And Blavatsky explains, dreamless sleep is one of the 7 states of consciousness known in Oriental esotericism. In each of these states, the individual is conscious in a different plane of his being. The term dreamless sleep in this case is applied allegorically to the universe to express a condition somewhat analogous to the state of consciousness in man, which, not being remembered in the waking state, seems a blank. You know, we have our waking consciousness, which is right now where we perceive the external world. Then we have a dreaming consciousness, which is a consciousness when we are dreaming in which we don't perceive the external world, we are perceiving an internal world, a world that our mind is creating. And then there is the dreamless sleep, which is the state of deep sleep, a state of sleep when there are no dreams, where there are no perception of any stimuli, So that dreamless sleep, when we wake up, we remember it as being a blank. We wake up and we may remember our dreams, but we don't remember what happened between dreams. We say, I was unconscious. Now, Blavatsky says, it's not that we were unconscious. We were conscious in a different state, in a completely different state, which when we wake up, we cannot quite retain, because we are used to a state of consciousness in which there are objects of perception. I am seeing this, I am hearing that, I am feeling this. But the dreamless sleep is a state in which the subject and the objects of perception become one. There is no separation. And our brain, unless it is trained through the spiritual life and meditation, our brain cannot retain any sense of that state of unity, and it just seems unconscious. This is why, again, when describing the sense of unity, the shloka described this as darkness, voidness, non-ego. So part of our training is to begin to consciously dwell in this state of unity, of non-duality between what I am and what I perceive outside of myself. If we consciously begin to dwell in this state, then we develop the ability to perceive and retain the sense of unity. So this is why the shloka says the universe was like in a dreamless sleep, in a state of unity where there is no separation between object and subject. And the last part of this shloka, and life pulsated unconscious in universal space. Again, unconscious in the sense of it's not conscious as we know it, therefore we call it unconscious. So life pulsated unconscious in universal space throughout that all presence which is sensed by the open eye of the Dhamma. So you see here there is again a kind of paradox, so that we don't fall in any of the extremes. It is said that life was unconscious throughout the all presence. The all presence gives the idea of an absolute consciousness, present everywhere, completely, all the time, an all presence, yet life was unconscious in this all presence. This is again, is a paradox to indicate that we are talking about a state which transcends what we know as consciousness and non-consciousness or unconsciousness. And the shloka says that the Dhamma, with his open eye, can perceive this all presence. Some people say, how do we know about this? Who wrote this? Who taught this to Blavatsky? How did they know this? But all these things are because they are the essence of what we are. We are not different from the universe. Remember the Delphic axiom, know yourself and you will know the universe. There is no difference, separation between the universe and ourselves. We are the universe expressed in this little fragment. So since this is the case, we can perceive all this. The Dhamma, which as we are going to see is a liberated being, through his open eye can perceive that all presence, and therefore it can be expressed in a poetical, paradoxical, allegorical language that we find in the shlokas. So Blavatsky explains, Dhamma means a purified soul, one who has become a Jivan Mukta. Jiva is a name for the spirit and Mukta, liberation. So it's a liberated soul, let's say. The Jivan Mukta, that is the highest Mahatma, so-called. Mahatma again, Maha is great, Atma is soul or self. So a great soul. So that's a Dhamma. His open eye is the inner spiritual eye of the seer. And the faculty which manifests through it is not clairvoyance as ordinarily understood, that is, the power of seeing at a distance, but rather a faculty of spiritual intuition through which direct and certain knowledge is obtainable. This faculty is intimately connected with the third eye. Blavatsky explains that there are two third eyes, so to say. There is one that is the exoteric third eye, and then there is another one that is the esoteric one. The exoteric third eye, the one that you will see depicted in most Eastern religions, has to do with this chakra, the Ajna chakra, the chakra that is supposed to be between the eyes. And the activity of that chakra, when that chakra is integrated to our waking consciousness, the person becomes clairvoyant, can see auras, can see what is going on in another place, as Blavatsky says there. Now, this kind of clairvoyance is still mediated by senses, by psychic senses. Therefore, it still brings illusion. We could, think that the third eye, this psychic eye that we human beings have, present the universe in a particular way that may be different in the case of a different humanity, or even in animals, how their third eye presents the universe to them. Remember when we discussed the idea of Maya, that our senses choose how to present the universe to us. So this exoteric third eye is still within the realm of illusion, is still within the realm of senses that mediate perception. Therefore, we still are separate from everything. She says the open eye, the true third eye, the esoteric third eye, has to do with the faculty of spiritual intuition through which you can gain a direct knowledge. You are not, through the spiritual intuition, you are not perceiving something that is outside of yourself. You become one with the object of perception, and you know about that from inside because you become one. There is a faculty in human beings that allow us to become one with everything or with anything that we may choose. When we have awakened this faculty, when we have integrated this faculty to our consciousness. So it is this particular conscious of direct perception, not mediated by any senses. It's direct because you become that. It is this perception that the Dhamma has, and by this perception, he or she can become this all-presence, and therefore the Dhamma can know this all-presence that stretched infinite boundless in the universe. And Blavatsky says, talking a little more about this, the common mortal can form no conception of reality of things separated from the Maya or the illusion which veils them, and in which they are hidden. Alone the initiate, rich with the lore acquired by numberless generations of his predecessors, directs the eye of Dhamma toward the essence of things in which no Maya can have any influence. So, knowing, for example, that the universe is supposed to come from this one form of existence, the adept directs his or her intuition in that direction and becomes one and knows the thing in itself beyond any illusion that senses can present. And the final sloka says, but where was the Dhamma when the alaya of the universe was in Paramartha? So we are going to see that the alaya of the universe is the universal mind, the universal soul, and that Paramartha is the state of absolute being and consciousness. So where was the Dhamma when even the universal soul was in this state of perfect unity? And the great wheel was Anupadaka. The great wheel may refer to the whole universe, may refer to the cycle of evolution, may refer to our own earth. And Anupadaka is a term that derives from a Sanskrit term which means parentless. I don't want to introduce too many terms, but Anupadaka is actually a misspelling of a Sanskrit term that means parentless. So where was the Dhamma when the universal soul was in this state of perfection, of oneness, and the universe was still without parents? So Alaya is literally the soul of the world, or anima mundi. You can say there is an alaya for our world, there is the alaya of the universe. During that time, during the time of perfection, of pralaya, the Dhyani Buddhas, which are these 7 highest beings, are one with alaya in soul and essence. Even the person strong in yoga, in mystic meditation, is able to merge his soul with it. This is not nirvana, but a condition next to it. In the theosophical view, nirvana is the condition of absolute non-conscious consciousness that is on the highest plane. Alaya is like the emanation from this, is the second cosmic plane, which is one of unity, but is one of unity with a consciousness of unity. Therefore, it is a state that is close to nirvana. It is still a state of unity. There are many levels of unity. We tend to think that enlightenment is something that happens once, you perceive unity, and that's it. There are, in the theosophical view, we could say there are 12 levels of enlightenment. The realization of unity in deeper and deeper levels. So the consciousness of Alaya, the universal soul, is a consciousness of unity. The nirvana is even beyond consciousness of unity. If we talk about these planes, in the theosophical view, the highest plane is the plane where Mula Prakriti, where this pre-cosmic substance exists. Then Alaya is the next plane, which is still a plane of unity, but it is already the beginning of manifestation. And then we have Akasha, which is the first manifested plane, where differentiation and duality and multiplicity sets in. So this is just for you to have an idea of what planes. The universe is at this point in the highest plane. It's not even at the level of Alaya. This is why Alaya was still in Mula Prakriti. It was oneness. But the state of Alaya can be, once it manifests, it can be perceived in meditation by the yogi. That's what Blavatsky says. So she goes on, the Alaya of the universe was in Paramartha. And she says Paramartha is self-consciousness in Sanskrit, Swasamvedana, or the self-analyzing reflection. From 2 words, parama, above everything, and artha, comprehension. This is a complex subject, but the idea is that after a period of evolution, the difference before and after for the monads, before a period of manifestation and after, is that at the beginning the monads were unaware of the unity. They didn't have paramartha. They were in the unity, just like we are in deep sleep. In deep sleep, it seems that we are not aware. With the spiritual training, the person may be in deep sleep, and yet that person is aware. Is aware of unity, is aware of non-difference, is aware of the nothingness. So this is the same with the monads. Before a period of evolution, the monads are in an unconscious unity. At the end of the period of evolution, the monads are in a conscious unity, a unity with paramartha, with this self-consciousness. And that is the difference, even though everything comes back to a state of unity, those monads that have engaged themselves in this process of evolution will be aware of the unity. And then the last part, and the great wheel was an upadaka. The great wheel is the whole duration of our cycle of being, the Mahakalpa, the whole Manvantara, the whole revolution of our special chain of 7 planets or spheres from beginning to end. The small wheels, meaning the rounds, the evolutionary rounds, of which there are also 7. So we don't need to go into too much detail of the cycles within cycles, but Blavatsky is interpreting this great wheel as the cycle of evolution. And we have here a diagram. Each one of these circles, A, B, C, D, are worlds on different planes in which evolution goes on. The lowest of them all, the physical one, is the Earth. Once we evolve in our evolution on Earth, at this point finishes, we go on evolving on higher planes. We go all around from globe to globe, and once we get to the highest globe, that is a round of evolution. Then there is rest, and then there is another round of evolution. So this is, we cannot go into too many details, but it's just for you to have an idea about what Blavatsky is talking about here. All right, so to finish, let's read the whole sloka again. But where was the Dhamma when the ally of the universe, soul as the basis of all, the anima mundi, was in Paramartha, in this absolute being and consciousness, which are at the same time absolute non-being and unconsciousness, and the great wheel, the great evolutionary cycle, was parentless. With this we finish the first stanza, which, as I said, talks basically about unity and about a state which is beyond our perception. As we go on with the stanzas, we will see that they begin to talk about things that are easier to conceive. But this stanza is fundamental because this reveals the true essence of what we are and that which we have to search for in our process of self-knowledge and meditation.